Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks, Mike, for that incredible remembrance that you just shared with us. I guess we'll go ahead and kick off the program, and our first presentation is going to be by Tim Shooter, sharing with us preclinical experience leading to endografts. Hi, Tim.
Well, what a crowd, huh? That's amazing job, Mike. I don't know, you must have blackmail material on everybody here, otherwise I can't imagine how you could round up such an audience. My task is to sort of get started with a history of the early stuff, the archaeology of EVAR, which is sort of an impossible task. I think every person in this room could deliver a first-person account of the early history of EVAR, and you know, it's pretty hard to follow the trail of breadcrumbs backwards into preclinical work. But I'm going to try to highlight some of the turning points and crossings in the road, and just really as a basis for discussion rather than a definitive account. One of the first things to say is that what we recognize as EVAR was certainly not the first attempt to treat aneurysms by non-invasive means. When I worked at Columbia, I was in the Blakemore lab, and one of the things Blakemore was famous for was putting hundreds of feet of wire into large aneurysms and applying electrical current to induce thrombosis, which was extraordinarily effective at inducing thrombosis. What it was not effective at was preventing aneurysm rupture. So I won't dwell any more on that, just to say that this was one of our goals and has been for a long time. I think it's important to remember that the basic understanding of how an endograft was going to protect against risk of rupture depended upon a number of completely untested assumptions. We assumed that abolishing perfusion through the sac would eliminate sac pressure, would reduce dilatation and reduce the risk of rupture. Now, all of these little connections have been demonstrated since, but you need to remember that when we started out, we didn't know that there wasn't going to be seepage enough through the stent graft to maintain the pressure within the aneurysm, that the little branch vessels weren't going to maintain the pressure within the aneurysm. There was a hell of a lot. In fact, what we didn't know vastly outweighed what we did know. Didn't stop us, though, moving forward into clinical care. And I have to say, much of the early work is indebted to the model that we used to test our assumptions, and that was the elderly Australian mainly, with some notable contributions from Europe. It's also important to remember that this slightly different approach, aneurysm exclusion, wasn't tried for the first time with endovascular stent grafts. It was tried with this procedure of bypass, which never really became popularized because it was a big open operation, but did demonstrate that excluding the aneurysm from flow top and bottom would protect against risk of rupture. So we finally concluded that if we achieved certain goals, we could prevent aneurysm rupture, and there were certain key features that we needed to be sure were present in our technique. There needed to be an impervious barrier, and I'll give a few examples of attempts to create stent grafts that weren't impervious and what happened there. We needed secure attachment, and that was probably the biggest failure mode in the early days of endovascular aneurysm repair. And then these devices needed to be inserted through remote vessels under fluoroscopic guidance, otherwise you really weren't getting the necessary bang for the buck. And so if you look back into the patent history, and that's probably where the first port of call when you want to know where things came from, look at what people were thinking about and what they were writing about and what they were patenting, because that's really where they were putting their money. And I dug up this patent from the 60s, done by Ursek, and you'd look at this thing, you'd say, oh yeah, bifurcated stent graft here, with a balloon extended polymer stent at each of the orifices. Well, yeah, that's what it was, but it wasn't expanded by a balloon, and it was put in through open surgery. So yes, moving in the right direction. No, not really a stent graft. You needed to have something capable of opening up after insertion from a remote location through a long, thin plastic tube. And that requirement was met by a variety of self-expanding stents, starting with Dotter and moving on through a number of others. But where is the impervious barrier? Well, there isn't one, so that doesn't count either. Well, what about the impervious barrier? There are, and have been several, examples of these porous tubes that we put into aneurysms, and then we say a little prayer and hope that everything will work out the way that we want it to work out, which is the kind of behavior that doesn't actually usually result in success. These stent grafts, something particularly of the cardiatis one, demonstrated that yes, they could redirect flow. Occasionally the angiogram would look okay, occasionally the CT scan would look okay, but more often than not, that would not be the case. Sometimes the branch vessels would thrombose and the aneurysm would not thrombose, and sometimes the aneurysm would rupture, and almost all the time the aneurysm would get bigger. So there were plenty of blind alleys. All right, back to the patent literature. What about a means of attaching the stent graft? Well, people focused on sort of surgical equivalents. Why don't we put some staples up there? And if you look, there were some really quite sophisticated descriptions of devices intended to use that mode of attachment, but none of them really worked. The only remnant that's left with us of an attachment mechanism, an endovascular attachment mechanism, is this little Aptus device that really is no longer used as a standalone. It tends to be used as an adjunct to therapy with other stent grafts. This device, which, you know what, it was really kind of sad, Ancure, because they produced something that actually worked, was safe in the long term, was a pretty nice durable device. It just had to break the system now and then to get it into place, which drove the regulators absolutely wild. They started out, if you look through the patent history, they started out with a mechanism of stapling and retreated into something that became a barbed stent. But it did actually work. Here's something that has an impervious covering, has Z-stents, for all the world functions like a stent graft, but actually it was put in under direct vision. Really no gain on the fluoroscopic stuff there. This is one that when I came across this and I was working in the field, I was profoundly depressed because their work was way, way more sophisticated than anything I had done. These guys were putting stuff in through a 12 French sheath, and the only reason they didn't advance to clinical use was they were working in a cancer hospital, MD Anderson, where Gian Turco was working. Otherwise, this device would have made a more prominent mark in the history. I'm not going to go into Volodos's contribution. Like most people, I was not aware of that until a long, long time later. And even then, I tried to go back through the literature. I couldn't understand head or tail of what was actually being described. So here's what ultimately became the basis for the first clinical use, a balloon extended stent sutured to the end of a conventional graft. Very effective politically, very effective at making surgeons wake up, which was about bloody time because balloons, stents, wires, sheaths, all the armamentarium of endovascular intervention had been around and had been in other people's hands, and the surgeons had been quietly, smugly ignoring this developing field. It was only when they saw one of their sacred cows about to be butchered did they really wake up. So probably this work is not only notable for its technical brilliance, it's notable for the fact that it was a wake-up call to all of vascular surgery. And thank God that the delivery devices needed a surgeon to put them in. Otherwise, I'd be looking out here at a group of radiologists. Well, you know, the one limitation of that work that was described, and you're going to hear more of it, was the fact that not many patients have a distal implantation site between the aneurysm and the iliac arteries. So what's one solution? Well, put in a uniiliac graft. The price you pay is an occluder and a fem-fem bypass. It's the same old rule. When an aneurysm has branches, you've either got to have an extra anatomic bypass to substitute, or you've got to have branches on your stent graft. Well, this was the extra anatomic version, and this was the branches on the stent graft version, which is a device that I produced. When we first started doing this, we were very, like everybody else, uncertain of how it would survive long-term in a very tough endovascular environment. So we constructed it out of graft materials, just like the ones that we had used before. We constructed it out of stents, like the ones that had been used before. We tried to do everything that had been done before. This thing went in as a unibody device. That was not an approach that really garnered much support later on. There are a few around. Here, I'm going to just give you a little clip of this. Well, maybe not, huh? You know, I've almost completely given up showing videos. The only point in this video is that they're all speaking German. And that's just a segue to the observation that the first cases we did were in '93 in Aachen, Germany. The way forward, I think, and I think everybody would agree, was bifurcated modular approaches. I looked in the literature for the first mention of that, and of course the first mention that I could find was me. I would not dispute the fact that you might be able to find others, but this was a description of a modular device. And I attributed the first modular work to these characters, criminals, of course, from Australia. And I do that because they produced the first modular bifurcated device that actually worked. Most people's experience was with the Mintec device that became the Stentor, that was Stentor, then became Vanguard 1, 2, 3, 4. They all failed. They went in pieces. They came out in pieces. Not a terribly successful experience, but actually introduced a lot of people to the concept of endovascular aneurysm repair. Here's another device that was beautiful to put in, beautiful to behold early on, not so beautiful down the line. And if you ever presented cases on that device in Europe, that you would hear some Gallic scorn as they wondered why you would ever use such a thing in the presence of enormous flow-related and pressure-related forces. So these are all the failure modes. You're going to hear more about it. I'm only mentioning this because it gives everybody here a little chuckle to think that very prominent vascular surgeons declared our entire field to be a failure. And they were right, actually. If all we had was the technology of the day, that would have been true. But, of course, as the professor sang in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success, and we all here have learnt a lot from our mistakes. Why else would we have exposed ourselves to so much radiation? And the product of that was largely convergent evolution. There's a lot of things that look very similar. And then there's some things that don't look so similar. This doesn't really have Z-stents on it. It has a totally different principle. This has polymer, totally different principle on those two graphs. Well, what about the extension of our field into other territories? Well, that depended largely upon the fenestrated devices. Again, the criminals from Australia. Some very, very advanced and sophisticated work led to that. I won't dwell on it, just to say that there were many, many different versions. And now we swim like salmon ever upstream. We finally got into the aortic valve, and we've had to stop there for a little while the technology catches up. But you know what? If you ever watched a cardiologist put one of those TAVRs in, you'll realize that they need us desperately, because their big catheter skills are not quite there. All right, thank you.
Moving on now to first-in-man history, it's a pleasure to introduce Juan Perotti, who's going to share with us his insight and recollections on the first-in-man EVAR. Juan?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Among all the pioneers, I'm sure every one of you made some contributions, and I pay tribute for those who are no longer with us. This was a long journey that started in the 70s. We should say that the present rate, the average American can expect to undergo 7 operations during her or his lifetime. Surgery was related to pain initially, and you can read this. William Hunter said that the anatomy is the basis of surgery. It informs the head, guides the hands, and familiarizes the heart to a kind of necessary inhumanity. So that was part of our treatment. The first minimally invasive thought came from Ambroise Paré, who said that sometimes the surgeon made more harm than the weapon itself. And my generation learned that, at least initially, that the greater the surgeon, the bigger the incision. There are many people who started with this kind of approach of minimally invasive. And as you know, the first durable treatment was done by Dubois in Paris. And we had a great operation, but as Roy Greenberg used to say, was a big operation, was durable and effective, but the patient suffered a great trauma. So I was a resident in 1976 at the Cleveland Clinic, and we had 2 consecutive patients having a bad outcome. And I told Al Humphreys, I think we are good surgeons, you have good care of the patients, but this operation is too aggressive dealing with these all undebilitated patients, and we need to come with something less invasive, less morbid, less lethal, and equally effective. At the same time, I was having training with a radiologist from the Mass General on how to do Seldinger technique. And I came with the idea of using the Seldinger technique, using a bigger sheath and introducing inside the sheath a graft and a metal component that could replace the suture. So in 1976, I did the first prototype. I went to the engineering department. I got stainless steel 150 SL from Sweden, and I learned how to weld. And what I did, it was 2 6 rings joined by 2 rings, two bridges to prevent collapse when I was deploying that inside the aorta. So that was a very simple system, 2 rings and 2 bridges. And in 1979, I went to see Toby Cosgrove after having a patient with paraplegia after type V dissection treated surgically. And I told him, listen, I have a metal cage. The name stent was not given yet. I have a metal cage covered that I think we can cover the entry site and treat type V dissection. So I applied for a grant that was rejected. And then I met Julio Palmas in 1987, and he convinced me that his stent was stronger than mine, and I adopted his balloon expandable stent. We redesigned that stent to go up to 30 millimeters, and we started the animal experience. And finally, in 1990, we did the first experiment. So in dogs, we were replacing the aorta with a graft with the shape of an aneurysm, and after 3 months, we were implanting this endograft that Tim Shooter showed. My clinic allowed me to treat patients who were rejected from other places, for 5 places, to have the open operation. And so we started to treat the worst patient. This patient had 10 abdominal operations, 2 open heart, and an ileostomy. And the initial operation was done with the simple things coming from a surgeon's mind. So it was a graft, a stent, a Teflon sheet, a wire, a balloon. We took from the cardiologist, valvuloplasty balloon, and nose cone. And this was the first operation. This was the first patient treated in September 1990. It was a patient who was a relative of the president, who could not have surgery because of severe COPD, and who was having rest pain. I'm not going to show this, but this was the big change. So this is a change in paradigm of the way we treated aneurysms. So we created a hybrid new specialty, and this was the first patient treated. I invited Julio Palmas to be with me first patient. We had an open case, and then we did the second one. We had dinner, and then we went back to see our patients. And the patient with the endovascular treatment was having dinner. And I told him, if this is durable and we can reproduce this could make a big revolution. And this was the first publication in 1991. Unfortunately, complete happiness doesn't exist, and we started to see failures because we were doing initially, as Tim said, aortics. So we were having distal leaks, and we decided to do a bifurcated graft. It was one piece. I tried with a friend of mine, the father of a friend of mine, to cross over and then place the bifurcated graft. Unfortunately, we had the first catastrophe, which was a massive microembolization, and we decided to simplify this and do aortounilex graft and fem-fem bypasses. As you see, this is a very primitive, but it worked. When we didn't have distal aortic neck, we were doing aortoiliac. Narrow external iliac, we were doing temporary conduit using a 10-millimeter Dacron graft. And when we had iliac aneurysms, we were doing embolization of the hypogastric or an anastomosis between the external iliac and the hypogastric artery. This is the first case we did in France, the first case we did with Michael and Frank in New York. And finally, this dream came true, and we were doing this percutaneously, as I said, in 1976 to Humphreys, that I was foreseeing a day in which the patient was coming walking and leaving the room walking with 2 Band-Aids in the groin. Then we learned that we could use this in aneurysm, dissection, vascular trauma, and occlusive disease. These are the people who started to work with these same ideas. Rupture aneurysm is a great application, and this is durable. This is a patient after 7 years follow up with this very primitive system. Also in 1991, we received a patient from the French hospital who had a rapidly growing aneurysm. He had a dissection, infrarenal dissection, and we treated this patient in 1991 with a cover stent, and this patient survived for 9 years. And that was published in the Annals of Vascular Surgery in 1991. Trauma was another application. This patient had surgery, massive bleeding, and was referred to our place, and we treated him under local anesthesia, placing a cover stent in the aorta. So I'm not going to insist with this because everybody knows what is the outcome of this. The broad application of endovascular aneurysm repair had led to a rapid decline in open aneurysm repair and improved patient survival, albeit of a high overall cost of care. The data from the U.S. Consensus Bureau says that there were 101,978 patients in the national inpatient sample affected by AAA over the 11-year span of this study. The average age was 73 years, 21 for women, and 90 were white. Overall, in-hospital mortality was 7%, with a median length of stay of 5 days and median hospital charges of $58,000. EVAR was associated with a lower in-hospital mortality, 4 versus 1, for unrupture, and 41 versus 27 for rupture. Shorter median length of stay, but a 27-36 increase in hospital charges. The overall use of EVAR has risen sharply in the past 10 years, 5.2 to 74%. So in hospital mortality for both rupture and unrupture have fallen to more than 50% during this time period. Conclusion, EVAR has lower perioperative morbidity and mortality. The survival advantage over EVAR over open repair lasted for 1 to 3 years in the different trials. In older patients, the survival benefit is higher, and there is an overall survival benefit in EVAR compared with open repair. In spite of all graft-related complications occurred in EVAR even during the late follow-up, obligating to lifelong surveillance. And this is an equation that endovascular is my choice too, from Albert Einstein, who died after rupture aneurysm. And the people from the American College were very kind of placing this technique we all developed as one of the big advances in the endovascular surgery. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Mike Dake. You know, he showed a picture of himself, which is sort of scary, and everyone goes, well, some things don't change. Do you have that first slide? Stop. Well, actually, things do change from 1991 to present. Hopefully, you can see the old Mike Dake here.
Well, I'm going to go through TVAR and how it got started here. As you know, at Stanford, this was sort of our focus. A lot of that has to do with our local particulars, but we'll get started here. And I'm going to sort of go back in history, and because it's sort of fun to look at the non-surgical treatment of arterial aneurysms. And you know, back when you couldn't do anything, and obviously open cavity surgery was prohibited, I mean, there were many things that were used to compress aneurysms from the outside. All of these contraptions, and these quotes you'll see are from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, obviously the famous Colombian author. But what I'd like to sort of focus on out of this whole litany of different things that were used and failed, and Tim talked about a lot of the failures, is this wiring of saccular aneurysms, because it's sort of an interesting history and has some parallels with how we ended up getting where we are with endografts. So we're back now in 1800s, 1864, and Tim was right. They used to stick needles into aneurysms and then insert a wire and then apply electricity to the wire. And the reason they did that is they knew that sort of albumin within eggs, they could coagulate by electricity, and this galvanism was thought to be a way that you could produce thrombosis of the aneurysm sac. And Moore and McEwen were actually the ones who were pioneering this, and so they would be technique where you would stick with a typical needle, pull out the trocar, and introduce these wires. And the wire wasn't meant to stay in, it was just meant to deliver the electricity. And then came this sort of extension of that, which I somehow was fascinated by. And it's a guy named Colt in Aberdeen. And he said, well, okay, we've got this trocar in here. What else can we place in there? And he developed these different whisks of different sizes. And they'd go in sort of like an umbrella shot through, and then they just pull back the trocar and they'd expand in the aneurysm and promote thrombosis. And this was done in a number of cases and written up, and it was called the palliative treatment of aneurysm by wiring. And one such case was, I saw here, was in St. Bartholomew's Hospital. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, that Dr. Thompson knows quite well, was the site of where Arthur Conan Doyle first had Dr. Watson meet Sherlock Holmes in a chemistry lab there. And obviously, Dr. Watson was supposedly trained at St. Bartholomew's. St. Bartholomew's, I think, has been relegated, or was relegated to a geriatric hospital. Now it's making a return with some merger. And so I saw this, and it said number 1551E. So I went to St. Bart's, and this is the slogan that's over as you come into the hospital, which I always sort of kind of liked. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. And this is the museum in St. Bart's. And the guy in the back, the statue is Paget, James Paget, Paget's disease, all of that stuff. And they had all these specimens, these wild, fantastic kind of elephant man type specimens of things you wouldn't see anymore, with erosion into the spine of aneurysms and all sorts of other things. And then I finally found specimen 1511E. And in this specimen were two of these whisks. So I took the specimen and I took it down to radiology, and I said, will you x-ray this? And of course this caused incredible consternation and gnashing of teeth, because there was no request or order form to do this. It was this guy just bringing this thing in formaldehyde. But there it is, and we got it done, and they're x-raying this thing with the whisk inside. And So it looked much like this, the x-rays that we received. You see these little whisks inside, and you say, this is so weird. Did anyone take up on this? And Johns Hopkins Hospital. This was a fellow who said, René Lariche requested of Dr. Halstead some information as to the end results of the ligation of large arteries at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And what Halstead was doing, he was taking these metallic bands, and this is his first case, and putting around the necks of these aneurysms. And that didn't work, so then he put one at the proximal and one at the distal and tried to isolate the aneurysm, and that didn't work. And here's Halstead working in Coker's clinic, placing an abdominal band above the renal arteries, and here's what happened to the patient. And I like the last thing, it says the aneurysm was almost cured. But in any event, what then he did was he started with this wiring, actually putting wire in there. And this is some drawings and cases, and you look at aneurysms like this and you begin to understand why this was even tried. I mean, aneurysms that we see, this wouldn't make any sense at all. And so they did 40 cases at Hopkins of these wired aneurysms and one case of McEwen's needle where they applied the electricity. And the reason they were doing it is because aneurysms aren't the aneurysms we see today. All the aneurysms back then were syphilitic, almost all. And when you look at this, and we knew that changed the whole sort of proportion of thoracic versus abdominal. For some strange reason, spirochetes like the oxygen tension in the ascending aorta much more than the distal descending, so they burrow their little holes there, and you end up with these more excrescens or protuberances, which you can see. Someone could think, I could stick something in there, and I could put in a bunch of wire or a few whisks, and that might take care of it. And this is kind of the interesting thing that shows in the 20th century, the solid curve is syphilitic and the dashed or broken curve is atherosclerotic aneurysms, crossing at about 1944 when obviously the therapy for syphilis was discovered. And what that changed was this transition between 30 and 45, between syphilitic to atherosclerotic, saccular to fusiform, and thoracic to abdominals. In 1905, there were 10 thoracic aneurysms for every one abdominal. In 1941, it had gone to 3.3 to 1, and now that's obviously changed. And in the thoracic aorta, 182 of 192 were due to syphilis. Here's Tim's friend, Blakemore. So Blakemore took this whole wiring thing to the absolute, unreasonable extreme of exotica and developed this sort of Rube Goldberg thing that looked like a fishing reel to throw this wire in to these things. And Blakemore, Sense-stocking Blakemore tube, Blakemore, Tim told you all about him at Columbia. He had this incredible apparatus for controlling the temperature of the wire once it got in the patient, and these bizarre trigonometric kind of machinations about how you could figure out the volume of wire to put into someone based on tomography. There's his setup. That's pretty bizarre, huh? And he went to the 1952 Southern Surgical Association in Hollywood, Florida, and he presented on the schedule. We believe that a thoroughly clotted aneurysm may be inactivated indefinitely. Our method of clotting saccular and fusiform aneurysms, if used according to the technique described, is safe and efficient. Heating the wire to 80 C causes a heat inflammation within the sac wall, which promotes adherence and organization of clot deposited. We conclude that the absence of signs and symptoms of growth of the aneurysm in 7 living patients operated on by this method and the relief of pain and symptoms due to distressing pressure justify us in recommending the procedure. So who is the next guy to present on the program of the Southern Surgical in 1952? Mike DeBakey. And Mike DeBakey presented a paper that he and Denton Cooley wrote on the surgical treatment of aneurysm of the abdominal aorta by resection and restoration with a homograph. And in a click of a minute, the whole thing changed. Out with the old, in with the new. Blakemore, who thought he was getting his spotlight in the sun, is immediately just upped by Mike DeBakey, and we're off on the surgical resection. This is DeBakey's. You saw some of Charles DeBose. This is DeBakey and Cooley's 1953 publication of that experience, and the fact that, again, even then they were having syphilis. One of them's number 3 was syphilitic aneurysm. And then here's Volados. This is, you've heard a lot about this. Obviously, I can't really say much about this. There's one English publication that we'll talk about a little later in the timeline of things. And then Juan, and you heard that, and he showed you this case. And this commentary by John Bergen, no longer with. John Bergen and I went to the same elementary school in South Bend, Indiana. Hard to believe. And John said, it has been said that the essence of great art is simplification. There's no doubt that the procedure described by Dr. Prodi achieves its purpose. Predictably, it would be offered at first to patients who have prohibitive risk for conventional aortic surgery. As experience grows, it will be offered to patients who are good surgical risk. Opposition to the procedure will be mounted. In vascular surgery, no change for the better has occurred that wise and good men have not opposed. Now that this initial barrier is broached, new applications including transluminal distal bypass are predicted. Such a change is inevitable. It is, as Thoreau said, a miracle to contemplate, but it is a miracle which is taking place every minute. So that takes us to us, and this case from, where's Craig Miller? There he is. July 20th, 1992. This was Craig's patient. He'd had a coarctation of the aorta repaired and now had opposite a pseudo-aneurysm on the opposite, was it pseudo, what was it? Pseudo-aneurysm opposite wall. And if you look at this with this hypoplastic transverse arch and the spatulated left subclavian with a wide mouth, you look at that, I'm not even sure we do that now, you know. So I think, but it was not the greatest first case to do. And there was the stent, and these stents were being developed in conjunction with Joe Rush, Barry Yoshida, and Hans Timmermans at the Dotter Institute in Portland. We had a great working relationship, and then it was decided by powers that be that this constituted some interstate commerce regulation, you know, something or other. So we had to make them ourselves. And we had a bevy of people from fellows from Japan and Korea and China that helped with this and learned from this. And we had one person who was constant throughout. There he is. He's here today. This is Bud Liddell, who came to us after graduating from Middlebury College. And Bud would iron out this Cooley, woven Dacron Cooley very soft graft on a PVC tube to get all the crimps out. Unlike Bolados, who boiled and stretched, we ironed. And he was involved in this. Bud is now, I'm happy to say, professor of interventional radiology at Johns Hopkins. So he came from our lab to there. And we did all sorts of these grafts, and I'll pop through these. You can see we had big ones, small ones, flexible ones with uncovered leading edge with little barbs that were not going in the right direction, but nonetheless. Tapered, reverse tapered. Ones with branches, or holes, fenestrations rather, not branches. All these things were tried. And that takes us to our first case. And we put all these little, as Scott remembers quite well, these polypropylene sutures through the eyelets of these C stents, and we gather them up, and then we groom them into this cartridge, and then it'd be ready to go, and we push it in. The initial cases were obviously quite an event. As you can see, we literally dipped the guy in betadine from head to toe, thinking the worst was probably going to happen, you know, and he would have to have a hemicorpiectomy or something or other to get the thing out. I don't know what we were thinking, but you could see massive prep. And there we are. I picked this one. This wasn't the first case, but the guy on the right, I think this is the only case I did with Tom. Tom, that's you on the far right, believe it or not, Tom Fogarty. That's you, not the patient, no. And here we go. We get this, and there's Tom looking there, and on the far right. We'd get these things in, ready to go, and these big tubes would go in, and here's our case. Now that's not much of a neck, right? And we put this thing in, and we're putting it in, and it gets to about here, and I said, Craig, we can't do this case. It's not going to work. We're going to pull this giant pipe back, and it's just going to fly into the subclavian because that was under some, you know. And if I deploy it in the subclavian, we have the chance that we're going to occlude the whole aorta, you know, because this is a big enough subclavian that this aortic graft would just go from subclavian to aorta, and that would be like a stovepipe. And he just said, do it. Just do it. And so we did it, and that's where it ended up. And it ended up thrombosing the aneurysm. It was kind of weird and lucky, I guess. And so in the end, we look back at all this as the good times, but in reality, I think our memory eliminates the bad and magnifies the good. And thanks to this, we're able to manage to endure the burden of the past. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. Reflecting just a little bit on these two first-in-man procedures. There's a difference between technology driving the direction we go and physicians who are trying to improve the quality of care for our patients driving things and working around technology to get things done. And I think the uniform theme here is you have individuals and teams that are really committed to improve the care of patients one way or another, and improve on the status quo. And have you heard woven throughout everything, this is not done without significant opposition or resistance from many of the people around us as this field advanced. So thank you to you both for sharing that history. Moving on to pre-commercial clinical experience and beginning that discussion, our next presentation is by Mike Marin, who's going to talk about aortic aneurysm preclinical experience and how that went.
What a terrific symposium. Mike, you are to be credited for pulling together such a group of people with such ideas. I mean, each talk has been more interesting than the next. Each one has brought new information to the table. I've known Tim Tudor since 1984, and it's nice to see that he's still quite timid in his activities. Tim, there are 3 armed officers outside from the Australian consulate after your multiple comments about prisoners. Continuing with the theme that Dr. Dake and the team have put together, if you look historically, what happened next was an evolution of what we would call preclinical activities. There were the pioneers who really put together the initial devices, came up with the ideas on how to build them, how to create delivery systems to get them into the body, and how to evaluate the success of the procedure. And the next phase of this was really preclinical devices, which took the ideas, took the devices created by the pioneers, and began to add numbers to that, add experience to that, which allowed us to get a better sense of whether or not this technology would work. One of the beauties of treating occlusive disease, regardless of where it is in the body, is that you have someone who's ischemic, you put in a treatment, either a bypass or a stent, and you know immediately there's a pulse, there's a restoration of symptoms. But with aneurysm disease, most of the time they are asymptomatic, so you really don't know for a year and sometimes many years as to whether or not we've been effective. So the next phase was actually getting the clinical numbers to increase using the ideas that were put together by these pioneers. I'm grateful to Dr. Dake for giving me this opportunity to give this talk. A talk that's history is one that I'm thinking the next step is to move next to Dr. Katzen here in Miami and put my teeth in a cup and retire. But history is important, and as we're learning from the previous talks, really gives us a guidance of what's happened in the past for stent graft developments. The point I want to make most clear is that this is truly a blending of technologies, and unlike almost any other area that we have seen in development of endovascular or vascular disease, we've seen a blending of technologies that were really aligned around different specialties. You had stent technologies, which were really in the interventional world with an interventional radiologist and cardiologist. You had vascular prosthetic grafts, which were in the purview of the vascular surgeons, and these came together to create a completely new technology. And with it came specialties that came together. And as you'll see, and could say we've already seen from the initial presentations, nothing was as important as the synthesis of the specialties over the course of this field's development that was responsible for the success that we've achieved today. If the interventional radiologists were fighting with the vascular surgeons, fighting with the interventional cardiologists, and resisting development, none of this would have taken place. The fact that these groups came together so well in so many locations around the world is truly a product of why we were successful and why so much has happened in this, what really is only 25 years. At our center in New York, led by Dr. Veith, we had interventional radiologists and surgeons who truly worked together, who added their expertise and knowledge that allowed us to come up with some of the ideas and actually be successful in the procedures that we were attempting to do. Our first case was in November of 1992, and as is apropos and correct for the development of this field around the world, if it weren't for the sharing of the pioneers of their ideas, this would not have propagated. Juan Perotti traveled to virtually all four corners of the earth to teach what he knew, to offer his knowledge, and to bring his devices and technologies to show them openly to the various interested parties so that the technology could develop, so that the technology could evolve. Without that teaching, each person would be starting over from scratch and the field would not progress. Such was the case with our first patient in New York. This patient had a large abdominal aortic aneurysm. Parodi came with his tools and his team. He showed us the devices. He showed us how he built them. He showed us how he inserted them. And he gave us the knowledge to begin to evolve ourselves as to how to change this. It's rare that someone is so sharing and giving in their knowledge. And I have to say, for my own professional career and for that of what happened in New York, it is directly a product of this sharing construct. These are some of the devices that Parodi showed to us in 1992, having conceptualized the tube graft and the aorta uniiliac graft around a simple balloon expandable prosthesis. This is the first picture, and the only reason I show it, I want you to know I had a full head of hair in 1992, and it was dark. This is a radiation exposure problem. I'm warning you all now. And the first day post-op, we sat the patient up, and Frank Feet suggested that we give him a Playboy, because the Playboy always comes out a month before the actual month that it is being inserted. And in this case, this is the December issue. Frank Feet keeps regularly at least 600 issues of Playboy in his desk at any one time. And this was immediately available to document the November time frame of this procedure. The device was simple, yet it had many challenges, and those challenges were openly discussed by Dr. Parodi and his team, and we began to innovate ourselves, as was happening in New York, in Sydney, and around the world, to try to come up with another device. And we came up with this modification purely as a way of managing some of the challenges we experienced. We built our own stainless steel Palmaz stent, which allowed us to get to sizes that were larger. We used a PTFE graft, which was dilated into a tulip form. And because we had challenges with sizing, we made one graft that fit the majority of the patients that were presented to us. With this single graft that could make a neck go from 20 to 30 millimeters, and a single length of graft that went to the femoral, not to the iliac, to the femoral, agreeing that we would sacrifice the internal iliac on the ipsilateral side on each patient, we're successful in treating over 260 patients using a relatively simple device. We could build one device, we could use it to treat virtually all patients, and a contralateral occluder system completed our repair. While this didn't have meaningful commercial capabilities, it did give us a significant amount of experience, allowed us to tell the story of endovascular repair taking place in New York to others, and stimulated industry and others to begin to think about how we might do these things better. What might be a more effective approach? While this worked quite well for treating infrarenal aneurysms, it also was used to what I think was probably the first ruptured aneurysm in the world, done by the group in New York using this simple aortoiliac system. It was far from a commercially available or commercially usable device because of the complexities of building, durability, and function. What did we learn from this time period? Well, we learned the importance of fatigue, and most importantly, that fatigue takes place in both the graft and the stent, and takes place in ways that we just could not conceptualize it. And the reason for that was that we really had no mechanisms of studying this initially, nor ways of in vitro testing these devices to ensure that they would have the durability to last for the life of a patient. So the first job was to come up with testing equipment and systems that could test this merged, blended graft of stent material and begin to tackle the problems of metal fatigue and fabric fatigue and what was required to achieve that when the two pieces were brought together. I show this because even with the almighty Palmaz stent, which is believed to be one of the most durable metallic structures, the fatigue that takes place inside the aorta, which is a relatively vicious environment, is so profound that even that it was susceptible to fracture. We learned the lessons of endoleak and the reminder of Dr. White's contribution in actually putting this idea on the map. I often criticized him for using the term leak, because all of us who practice in this field knows what it's like. Every time you have a type 2 endoleak, you get 15 phone calls from the CT scan reading and from the patient and their families with grave concern that the patient has a leak. If only he could have come up with something else like incomplete exclusion or something that was a little less catchy. We learned a lot about anatomy, and nothing is more important than neck, whether it's present or not, what its shape is. We never really believed this as significant a problem, since when we did open surgery, this particular feature was not as important in achieving a successful aortic aneurysm repair. But it is particularly important. The anatomy of the aneurysm becomes the driving force, less about the comorbid illnesses, which is what was the driving force of success with open aortic repair. Finally, I want to finish off with this comment that it is the teamwork that was responsible for the success that we achieved. Radiologists, surgeons of all types, cardiologists, all coming together allowed for both the sharing of patients, but the sharing of knowledge and technology that has resulted in some of the things that we see today and the great success in what the pioneers that we heard about earlier were able to produce. Mike, thank you again for putting this together. This has really been spectacular, and I think the rest of the day should be similar.
So Mike, I guess, ask you once again to take the podium and tell us how things progressed in the thoracic aorta.
Thanks, Scott. And I promise this is the last time you're going to hear from me today. And I've asked Monique and Lisa to pass around a little handout that is admittedly abridged and has a slight Stanford bias, not much, that goes into a timeline. I decided to present this pre-commercial clinical experience in a timeline, and I hope you may find it useful after today as well. It's got actual, as close as I could get, the actual month of something, whether it was just an experience, a publication, a patent, and then there's some little black brackets that I just was absolutely mesmerized by the fact that there could be these conjoining of things in like the same issue of a journal, that you would have two people saying just an incredible confluence coming together. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. So I'm going to start my timeline with Charles Dubros. You've heard that. One of the reasons I picked this is because he was working at a hospital in Paris called Broussais. And Broussais has also been decommissioned, as it were, like Bart's, and even more so than Bart's. But Broussais is where the first thoracic endograft in France was performed, and we went there and performed it with Professor Fabiani and Marc Sapoval at Broussais when they were working in Broussais. And so we'll start there, and then we're going to just show you that case because it's remarkable. This is March 29, 1951. And here's the actual case. And you can see the aneurysm extending into the right iliac, and there's a stenosis there as well. And this is what was done with a 14-centimeter long graft. And there's the angio afterwards. And that was a remarkable first, which of course led to Mike DeBakey. And then eventually in 1964, Charlie Dotter with the first angioplasty. And these all sort of, again, it's this sort of crescendoing up with all these technologies, as many have mentioned. This is a conjoined thing that I find remarkable. Volados and Gianturco. Gianturco, you may know, started at the University of Minnesota. Then he went to MD Anderson. He ended up at the Carle Clinic in Champaign, Illinois. And so that, as you think about where he went, why did University of Minnesota, then Andy Craig, all these other people, that was a focus, a mecca. Then MD Anderson, and you showed, Tim showed some work from MD Anderson. Everywhere Gianturco went, he brought with him new things, and there was cross-fertilization, pollination. Both of these guys realized the importance of Z-stents, and here is the patent or the Russian certificate from the USSR of the Z-stent, which was issued in May 1984, 4 months before Gianturco had his patent issued. Now, obviously, one's Russia, one's US. These guys were so close. It's crazy. And you can see here that obviously Gianturco knew that that a graft to do aneurysms would exclude the aneurysm thrombose. This was on his mind. Obviously, they were right there together on this development. And this, of course, is then Gianturco's first case, which was, again, a single Z-stent at the proximal end with graft material below to treat occlusive disease. And if you're interested, this is obviously ex post facto, 2013, and Volados, as you know, died in 2016. But this is a very interesting article, and the citation is on the upper left if you'd like to read it. Just some more pictures, and that's his fem tibial that was done in conjunction with this. And then in March 87, this man who had been, this is a chronic traumatic case. This again was a case that Volados did as his first aortic case. Again, now stents in this case were at only top and bottom. The middle segment was not stented. And this created some problems for Volados, because unlike our stent, which came later, which was stented throughout, which you could push in, as he would push in, the stent, the graft material would collapse. It would concertina down, and this was a problem. And why? Because these were just thought of as anchors. They weren't thought of stenting the whole thing. They were supposed to be anastomosis-like anchors. They weren't really. So what, and here, of course, is Juan. We talked about that. But in this case here was the first hybrid procedure by Volados, which involved debranching of the arch and then a stent graft placed in the thoracic aorta in the proximal descending. He had to develop this crazy thing where he had dual access, where you would get an access, in this case the ascending, and this whole device would be sort of pulled into place, encapsulated in a little cocoon, if you will, so it wouldn't get compressed, and then it would be opened up and then deployed in place. So this is how he carried on. And this, I think, was the main encumbrance that really prevented Volados from doing more aortic cases. Because when you look at this was, it's kind of Herculean thing to do. And why it didn't end up just stenting the whole graft, I don't know. But this was the contraption that was used. And this was obviously the result of that hybrid case. And here he is working. And here's the article, the one English article that was then done sort of contemporaneously. It's about 2.5 pages, and I don't mean to be too pejorative, but it's kind of like a letter to your mother or something. You know, there's not a lot of science in this. And when you look at it, you can see there were 51 cases, of which 26 were iliac occlusive disease, 22 were abdominal aorta, some stenotic, some aneurysmal, 2 TEVARs, and 1 failed attempt at a bifurcated AAA. He got his graft because it wasn't stented, the limb twisted and caused occlusion of his iliac limb, so he had to convert that. Of course, we talked a lot about Juan and this, and we talked about our case. And this is our first traumatic case in September of '92. This was a woman who was an unlucky victim of some sort of shooting between 2 gangs. And you can see in the supraceliac location, she has a pseudoaneurysm there. Again, kind of close to the celiac. Our first few cases were kind of not really ideal, but in any event, that was her. And I want to give a shout out. Dominic's going to talk later, but Jeff Rubin sends his regards. He's in Cambodia with his family. He sent his sentiments. We may have a chance to share those with you. But there was a lot of other stuff going on. I think in this spirit of multidisciplinary sharing, what was going on at Stanford at the time was CT. It was called spiral CT. I'm going to tell you, as you know, this is the weirdest thing. We had at the time, it was just a matter of time, had the only Siemens CT scan capable of spiral CT outside the factory. You probably don't know, because you're almost certain, what spiral CT was developed for. It had no application to angio whatsoever. The only reason spiral CT was developed, which later became, CT angiography, was for lung nodules. Because people, when they would CT scan, they would breathe, and you'd see this like half a nodule, and you really couldn't tell how big it was because, there was always misregistration on these sequential CTs. If there's a way we could scan in one breath hold, and then we could really see that nodule and understand it. So here's this machine, and it's in our parking lot out by the ER now, and Jeff Rubin has this idea, since it was developed for the chest, let's do pulmonary emboli. And we'll give some contrast and see what that does. And I said, Jeff, we can't take patients who are pulmonary emboli and put them out in a parking lot somewhere. I mean, they're sick, you know, it's not going to work. So, but why don't we try something like renal artery stenosis? Because we don't have a good way to look at that. And if we could get rid of misregistration, renal artery stenosis, this could be a screening thing. So I got this call in the afternoon and said, you've got to come down here immediately. You will not believe these pictures. So these were the first, and no one at Siemens had any idea that this was an application, that this machine could do this, you know. We didn't do anything, we just gave contrast and scanned, and then when it reconstructed, as if it were a lung nodule, here were these images that just literally blew your mind at the time, because there was nothing nothing like this, you know. Very strange. And then we did, I'm not going to steal Craig's thunder, but we did some work on experimental type B dissections. And then Andy, Craig, and I did the first fem-pop graft placements. We did some at Stanford, we did some at his hospital in Minneapolis, and I remember this was at that same time, and in the same time that Volados was moving forward. This was a aortopulmonary fistula that he did. And this was, in 1993, this was his fourth TEVAR. So this whole problem with the sort of having a non-stented center graft was creating problems. We then did some work with arterial and venous stenting in the carotids. And in the same issue of Radiology was published our work with the iliofemoral DVT. So this is what was going on at the time, and these years of 1993, 94 here at Stanford were very exciting because there was just such a complete revolution in terms of doing things. So preclinical work, this was published, and you can see there's Bud Liddell's name there, our first article in New England Journal, which was quickly followed, sort of remarkably, the next year with a elephant trunk case, which I still don't think we really understand the role of elephant trunks, frozen or not, in treatment of thoracic aortic disease. But this was our first elephant trunk case, and here you can see results of an elephant trunk like we do them today. Scott Mitchell published 44 patients in JTCVS in 1996, so we were really ramping up, and this was with Scott's actuarial survival for that group of 44 patients. We then started using Stent-Grafts in neurovascular disease. That's a giant aneurysm of the carotid that we were used to treat. And this Charlie Simba then published in 97, 11 patients with aortic rupture. And I wish Charlie could be here today, but he is also in Asia with his family on vacation. But he really wanted to be here with us. Then Jeff White, name that we talked about earlier, they published in this series in 97 3 cases of thoracic aortic disease, and so other people were now obviously understanding that it wasn't just EVAR, there was also TEVAR opportunities. This was our experience in traumatic thoracic aortic aneurysms, mycotic aneurysms, and then in 1998 we published 103 patients, and you can just see how this was ramping up in terms of TEVAR. Now, they weren't all good cases. I showed one case because I'm not going to be involved in the case presentation this afternoon. This man was from Israel. He was sent to us because he was a member of the Mossad. He'd been in the Secret Service, and this was a mycotic aneurysm, and for some reason the IR guys there had tried to wire it, and you can see one lonely wire just being swallowed by this aneurysm. It's kind of sticking up in the aorta, and so I don't even know why, but I decided it would be best to get that wire out there. I don't even know if it mattered, but so we spent some time, got the wire out, I think Scott did this maybe, did this carotid subclavian bypass so we could have a proximal neck, and the device deployed, and it folded like a clamshell or a book with the spine pointing into the aneurysm, obstructing the aorta. And so there we are, just sitting there going, bloody hell, what are we going to do with that? So this was the first case of truly endotrash. So I just ballooned it into the aneurysm and figured, what the heck, we'll just dump it in the aneurysm, which we did, and there it is now sitting in the aneurysm. So just like the whisk of Colt, we're trying to thrombose this thing. And then we put another one on top of it, which this turned out not to be the first case of endotrash, but also was the first chimney case, because I went over the left carotid of the carotid subclavian, so we had to come down and obviously stent into that, into the aorta from the left carotid. And there's the finish on him, nice little halo in the aneurysm. And this just shows again that the one thing I take home from all this is that we segregated out those patients who are surgical candidates and non-surgical candidates, and not surprising, there's a big discrepancy between if you were deemed a high surgical risk, not capable of having surgery, or if you could have surgery, and those who obviously were non-surgical candidates in the long term had a significant fall off in terms of mortality. Finally, we were involved. I was at the University of Virginia, but I thought you might like, see, this is the first commercial case, so I've taken you through pre-commercial to commercial. This is a woman who had TB and had a thoracotomy for TB, and she had this expanding lump, and they were about to biopsy this, and someone thought they should get a CT, and here's the CT, and this was the first commercial case in the U.S. in March of 2005. Obviously, a kind of a unique case, but she was from rural Virginia, and that was just a simple stent graft. So in closing, this is our group looking. Stephen Key, who's head of IR in UCLA, is in the back. Mahmoud Razavi, Dan Z, right here, who's with us at Stanford, Suzanne Slonim, and then myself, Charlie Simba, and Sean Samuels. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. You know, in looking at all this pre-commercial activity, I think all these were man-made, basically. All these devices had to be made by ourselves, more or less, using various components. And Mike, you might be interested. I was showing, thinking about this. We did a live case where we did a live thoracic case at IVUS where we made this and installed. And I was showing to some people at the hospital. I must have been in the mid-90s, and they said, "Where was this done? You know, how could it be done?" And when you think at how all people like you and everybody that was involved in this pre-commercial generation of new devices where we had to manufacture ourselves, and whether that could happen today. And I know we're going to talk more about this later. It was an incredible period of time where you could actually have physicians with ideas developing these unique solutions and establishing the basis for commercial activity, whereas today it's probably the reverse in terms of how you have to advance innovation. Anyway, I'll share that videotape with you at some point for your keeping. Our next presentation is Craig Miller, who's going to share with us the pre-commercial experience with aortic dissections. Craig?
Thank you, Barry. It's a fascinating group that Mike has assembled here, and at times it feels like yesterday. At other times it feels like 100 years ago. But it's only been a quarter of a century, and the pioneering, exciting, intrepid days with the blind leading the blind, we couldn't get away with any of this today. IRBs notwithstanding. And Dorothy's here. I think she'll talk about the regulatory pathways and how we have reached a semi-civilized rapprochement. My job is to take you from aneurysms of the thoracic aorta to dissections, and as you know, it's followed soon thereafter. But we had talked about it a long time, and we had done some sheep and dog experiments to see if it really worked. We could create an acute type B dissection in a surgical model, jack up the blood pressure, watch it propagate, and then put this or that in. And we still were not at all confident that this was going to work in man. But that didn't stop us, did it? First, we have to talk about risk stratification because this still is a key determinant of what you do and the results of what you do. We still operate on patients with acute type B dissections, believe it or not. We may be the only center in the world, but those with connective tissue disorders, Marfan's and Ehlers-Danlos, Loeys-Dietz, we still feel this is the only way and the best way. And it's actually gotten a lot safer compared to the old days. Subclavian branch there, perfusion with an open distal here. This still has a role, but as in anything we do as interventional cardiologists, radiologists, or surgeons, the results mirror your stringency, your rigor of patient selection. It's something all of us learn as a surgical intern. I don't know about interventional radiology, but it still remains paramount, and we have to consider that. So we looked at 189 acute type B patients treated here at Stanford medically, interventionally without stent grafts, or surgically over a 36-year period. And as you can see here, the medical therapy group's in red, surgical is in black, and the U.S. population in blue. And you can see these patients do not do very well. There are not many series of acute type B dissections taken out to 10 or 15 years, but it's pretty much a fatal disorder, not so much short-term, but also long-term. And what you do should be predicated upon what you're striving to accomplish, both acutely and chronically. In the mid-1990s, after this preliminary animal work, we thought it might work, but we were not at all sure it would work. These were the old days. Mike has shown many of these, and Bud's there ironing out the coulis very soft graft the night before. These were made on the spot. Like you say, there was no order. This was chaos. And we'd find a patient, we'd size them up, and then that night, all of the fellows in Mike's lab would homebrew these things together. And it was quite an experience. And in those days, you can see we were putting garden hoses up for the femoral artery of these elderly atherosclerotic patients, sometimes not all that successfully. But it was the old days. The answer came to us when a patient was admitted to our service, a young man, 44, hypertension, with an acute B dissection, and he had persistent pain. He also had an exacerbation of his blood pressure. Note that neither of these subjective soft criteria, by today's standard, constitute what we can legitimately call a complicated acute type B. But he subjectively was a complicated type B, and I went down to visit him on B1 and told him we needed to open his left chest. We were going to put him on the heart-lung machine. We were going to replace his proximal descending aorta to save his life. Whether that's true or not, who knows? He probably was uncomplicated. He probably would have done fine, and we just treated him medically. But he said, "No way, doctor. I don't like this big cut on my chest. What else can you offer?" So Mike was up in the lab that night, and we started talking about it, and then took Mike down and introduced him. And this volunteer, human volunteer, no coercion, his suggestion was to try and put a stent graft in this acute type B. Thankfully, the primary intimal tear was a goodly ways away from the subclavian artery. We were able to cover that with two 5-centimeter Palmaz stents with the old homebrew Stanford, just two linked together, 10 centimeters. We still had persistent filling retrograde from a large fenestration of the celiac artery going back, filling the false lumen, as you see in these two pictures. And therefore, Mike said, why don't we take a bunch of Palmaz uncovered stents and lay them in the true lumen below the stent graft, equivalent to the contemporary Cook petticoat concept that we use today. And we did it. And actually, it looked pretty good. When he left the lab, he was not paralyzed. He was happy. He didn't have a big scar on his chest. And we followed him pretty carefully. Here you can see some axials over the years where the false lumen thrombosed, and then the thrombus involuted, became fibrous, and eventually disappeared over years. Here are some VRs, 20 months, 7.5 years, and 10 years afterward. It looked like we'd left behind a pretty good-sized Crawford Extent 4 thoracoabdominal aneurysm, which I was itching to fix. But he kept saying, no, let's watch it. And we got more follow-up this year, 21 years after our first case. It's always better to be smart or to be lucky than smart. We all know that. Was this just good fortune, or was this good patient selection and good treatment in these pioneering days when we didn't really know what we were doing? The chronic dissection of his thoracoabdominal aorta stayed very stable, so he made the right decision. And if you think I've photoshopped some images together and I'm not telling you the truth, I'd like to introduce Mr. Van Kou, if you'll come up front. 21 years after the first dissection, first treated with a stent graft. He's 65 now, and he looks pretty good. Still got a few blood pressure problems, right? But you made the right decision. We didn't. Thank you so much for coming. So, where'd we go from there? This is Mr. Cow just this year, and everything looks remarkably good, including the uncovered stents in the true lumen. This was the first paper in 1999. Many of you know it was in the same issue in New England Journal as Chris Nienhauber's paper on subacute dissections, and it really launched the bandwagon. 19 patients. Try and get a paper published in the New England Journal today of 19 patients followed retrospectively. Good luck. We had total thrombosis of the thoracic false lumen in 15 patients. 3 of the 19 patients died, and this was a combination series from Mie University in Japan and Stanford. So it looked like it was promising. Looking at the follow-up of the true lumen, you can see the true lumen increased, as you would hope, after covering the primary intimal tear, whereas the overall size of the aorta decreased where the tear was and stayed the same. We were happy with this out to 3 years at that time. We then looked at more patients from Stanford. This is in 2008. We had 16 patients, but things were not as rosy without the Mie patients. 25% had died by 1 month. And so we knew we had to do more work on either patient selection or the treatment itself. We were, however, encouraged by the lack of late deaths and the lack of late reinterventions in these surviving patients. 76% were alive at 5 years. In that same issue, the Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery, Chris Nienhauber was asked to write an editorial and nihil nocere on the rocky road to endovascular stent graft. I have pledged to Chris that he's going to take this quote to his grave. It's going to be on his tombstone. Here is his editorial, and here is the gist of his editorial. And I think it's important that all of us remember this every day when we assess what we've done, the results of what we've done, and we think of what we can do better. Nevertheless, even in a world of rapidly advancing technology, it is ironically still wise to remember old principles of responsible use of clinical judgment. Chris, you may want to eat those words, but they're going to haunt you for the rest of your life. Rod White was the primary instigator or perpetrator, if you will, of the physician-sponsored dissection study at 5 centers. This was Arizona Heart with Ted Dietrich, Roy Greenberg at Cleveland, Rod White at Harvard UCLA, we here at Stanford, and Dr. Criado at Union Memorial. We had accumulated 85 patients who truly had an acute dissection, less than 14 days of duration, with follow-up out to 1 year. The SVS, Multidisciplinary Outcomes Committee, looked at these data and reported them and sent them to the FDA, which was one of the main reasons that clinical approval was ultimately forthcoming. Here you see the major early adverse events according to timing. In blue is the acutes. Subacutes are shown in red, and the death rate there was 10%. If you look at the late major adverse events, and more importantly, look at the 1-year survival, the point estimate there for 1-year mortality was 11%, almost unheard of after any treatment of acute type B dissection. And so this then paved the way for subsequent FDA approval, and we know what happened after that. The rest is history. It's not always such a pretty picture. Mike has shown you some disasters. Here is a failed attempt to treat an acute type B dissection with a stent graft, followed by embolization of a wheelbarrow full of garbage parts found in the garden, and it didn't work very well and required surgical removal and a surgical graft replacement. We always should forget that we have not conquered this disease, and acute type B dissection will always remain a very humbling surgical and medical challenge. I would like any of you in the audience to tell me how we can treat this patient with an acute type B dissection with a totally thrombosed false lumen, occluding the true lumen. Thank you very much.
So we'll take a break, and let's reconvene. We're just a little bit behind schedule. Reconvene in 10 minutes.
Okay, we are going to start the next session with Tom Fogarty, my good friend here. And the session is called Early Global Experience. And I have the great honor to introduce my good friend Tak Oki from Japan. Tak?
Mike and everybody, thanks for putting this together, and also thank you for the kind invitation. I'm going to briefly go over the next 10 minutes about what we've been doing in Japan related to stent grafting. This is Dr. Kato in Japan, who started animal experiments a little after some of the pioneering work that you heard this morning. He was doing a similar kind of work in 1992, 1993, and animal experiments related to dissection, acute dissection. And I think in 1995, this was a pretty seminal paper. He published a paper on how to predict those type B dissections, uncomplicated type B dissections, which might enlarge. And in 95, he predicted that maximum diameter at presentation of 4 cm and a patent thoracic entry site, which has been proven to be true subsequently. This was published in 1995, so I think he takes a lot of credit for predicting who enlarges and who doesn't. He also did his first, this was probably the first TVAR or EVAR in Japan, which was in 1993, debranching and TVAR for acute type B dissection. He also published in 1998 the first report of TVAR for acute dissection. The first case was done in 93, didn't publish until 98. So in Japan, there were a fair amount of early work. This was the first frozen elephant trunk case that he did in 1994, published in 1996. Pretty impressive work for that day. He also published and did work on hybrid repair, first done in 1997 and was published in 1999. You might know of Dr. Shin Ishimaru, who worked closely with Scott Mitchell, and he did his first case in 1995 using a homemade stent graft. In those days, he was holding these international conferences on an annual basis. And this is a paper written by Scott Mitchell and Dr. Shin Ishimaru, published in 2002, talking about the landing zone, zone 0 to zone 4, which is now widely quoted. Another thing that the Japanese are proud of is the branched stent graft. This is the Inoue graft with 3 vessel branches in the arch, and he published a series of 19 patients treated with this stent graft in 1999. However, none of these stent grafts were commercially available, not approved. So you can see the number of stent grafts in Japan only being done on occasional cases with these homemade stent grafts. So we had some pioneers, but it really didn't take off because of lack of approval. During this period, I was at Montefiore with Frank Weiss, Michael Marin, John Chan, not Chan, Yuan Chang, sorry, and I was away from Japan. I had a great time in New York for 12 years, Juan Parodi and the Vascular Innovation Team. And I returned to Japan in 2006 after 11 years in New York. When I went back to Japan, there was almost nothing except for the original Palmart stent. There was no stent graft, no carotid stent. There wasn't even a self-expanding stent that was available. This shows the commercial available timing in Europe and in Japan and the US. So the first stent graft was approved in 97 in EU, 99 in US, and it was not until 2007 that became available in Japan. So when I returned to Japan in 2006, it was right at the timing of the Japanese approval. So I learned the lesson from the VIS meeting, doing live cases and promoting and trying to convince the old way thinking Japanese surgeons. So I put up this first Japan Endovascular Symposium in Japan, gathered fair amount of participants and these kind of cases. Note that most of the devices, TAG, excluder, angioguard, all of them were privately imported because they were not approved. We've been doing this live case in Japan in order to promote this excellent technology that was available in the US but not so in Japan. And because of, and talking about reimbursement, in 2007, the first endograft, which was the Zenus, was approved, and you can see the very good pricing of the Zenus compared to other country. So we came in late, but came in with a favorable condition. At the time, one thing I have to talk about what's unique in Japan is the development of this committee, Stand-Graft committee, which came along with the hand in hand with the approval of the stent graft. 11 different societies came together and set up this rule of who can and where we can implant and use stent graft. Unless we have approval from this committee, we cannot reimburse, we cannot charge and get reimbursed. And this was a pretty strict rule. You had to, the hospital had to do at least 30 vascular cases and 10 aneurysms. And you have to get approval from the surgeon if you're a radiologist or cardiologist. And requirement for the operator had to include 20 cases of endovascular iliac and 10 cases of AAA. So that put a high hurdle on cardiologists trying to enter this field. By now, 2015, 500 hospitals and about 1,000 doctors had been certified by this committee. Because of this strict regulation, there have been only a handful of cardiologists, thank God, entering the field of endografting. So I give full credit to this committee of keeping an eye on who should do what. And once again, I show you this slide where stent graft in Japan, there were many innovators, but really didn't take off until the approval of stent grafting. First year, I was back in Japan, GK University, and we were doing half of the country's stent grafting and clearly dominated. The second live symposium captured 1,000 participants in Tokyo, and that has led, along with the approval, the enormous growth of stent grafting in Japan. Now we have 5 different stent graft approved in Japan, which is not too bad. And the number of stent graft cases has reached 10,000 with various types of stent graft, and we do about 60% now of all AAAs with stent graft. We are lagging a little behind US in terms of the ratio, but we are catching up. The market leader in Japan is Excluder, followed by Endurant, and then Zenus and Endologics. The outcome, we tracked every single case. You see the track record, the follow-up percentage. Almost 100% of every single case in Japan is tracked by that committee. And unless you submit your follow-up, you would not be certified. So here is 3,200 cases, and the hospital mortality in Japan, because of that strict regulation, is extremely low with fairly respectful outcome. If you compare the mortality rate to the US data, the 0.5% mortality as well as others are quite good, and I give credit to the committee for this excellent result. At GK, we've done, over the last 10 years, about 2,000 TVAR, EVAR, with also respectful results. We have contributed to a number of international trials, combined US and Japan, and here are the Japanese sites enrollment number. For example, for the INCRAFT trial, for the Misago Osprey trial, the Japanese sites enroll faster than the US sites. And final word on TVAR, it was introduced in 2008, and I was the only proctor that was a problem in terms of the penetration. Again, only 2 cardiologists who can do TVAR in Japan, and the rest is IR or vascular surgeon. About half of the thoracic aneurysm treated in Japan are done by TVAR, and the rest by open method. You can see, interestingly, that the decline in open surgery has not been so much. So we have added a number of cases with the TVAR. In Japan, we have this fenestrated stent graft called Nayuta, which has been approved for arch aneurysms, such as shown here. As in total, we've done about 800 cases so far with fairly respectful result. This is Japanese FDA approved. There's lots of dissection cases in Japan, and also there's this is a breakdown of aneurysm, and you can see a large number of arch aneurysms in Japan. This shows that there's 19%. This is this. 90% of all the TVAR cases are done in zone 0. And the dismal thing is that the stroke rate of the entire country, 3,000 TVAR cases, 734 for zone 0. The stroke rate is 15.7, and for zone 1, 6.6. So there's some work to do in this field. At GK, we have done 169 TVAR for arch. We have developed some tricks, and we have pretty good results in terms of stroke rate. Retrograde in situ fenestration are unique to Japan with pretty good results. So in summary, several significant contributors: Ishimaru, Inoue, Kato, and the Nayuta stent graft, and some work left to do for the arch aneurysm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tak, very much. Next speaker is Krasi Ivansev, who was very generous, and he helped Team Schroeder and I think some others.
Roy Greenberg. But
yeah.
I didn't help them, they helped me. So thank you for having me here, Mike Dake, organizing such a remarkably good meeting, having all the giants in the audience, and I almost feel, too little, too insignificant to tell you about what was in the history of Stangrafts. I'll start, of course, with Nikolai Voldos, and maybe it's an advantage that I speak Russian, so I met him, talked to him. I'll give you my personal view on the guy. He actually was in ideal situation to just make such a great invention. He was young. He was employed chief of the vascular unit in Kharkov, which is the center of the industrial complex still of former Soviet Union. They were engineers making the rockets for the satellite in the Soviet Empire. He had all these engineers next to him. He had extensive experience from trauma surgery, working as a young surgeon in coal mines in Ukraine. He's Russian, he's not Ukraine, major difference, has to be pointed out. And he had a full support of developing replacement of anastomosis. So they started very simple dog experience, had wooden spoons for their wives' sewing boxes. Didn't work because of ischemia, and they tied it up over aorta. Then moved to the balloon expandable stents, found it not giving them the results they wanted. They had all the literature from Dotter, Grunzig, and the rest coming from this card translated into Russian, and this is how they come up with the Z-stent. And Z-stent and zigzag stent basically is remarkable in terms of resemblance how the engineers, the rocket science engineers in Soviet Empire calculated the stent to be exactly the same way that the stent Cook is using today. They calculated all of that, already in 1987. Unfortunately, and that's why it's good to be here and to talk about Nikolai Volodos, is that not only that his great invention was not accepted, not spread out, unfortunately they shut down his hospital after the fall of the Soviet Empire, and he was completely rejected. But at least he's mentioned now by us here, and we give him all the honor for the work that he's done. That's the patient he treated, 87, 16 years later, and he did very well. And of course, we know that Juan started a revolution here in the West, and following that, I met Tim. I met Tim Chuter. Where's Tim? He's gone. Great Tim. And this is the young days. I met Tim, and somehow it struck a friendship between Tim and me. And he went on and placed his, I don't know for what reason, but I forgot to tell you that Tim had exquisite experience with catheters, and that was very surprising to me, being interventional radiologist, spending 25 years before using catheters. Same was with Volodos. He was an angiographer. He was doing his own coronary angiography, so all that is a prerequisite for developing this technique. Tim did his Festgraft bifurcated, very sophisticated device, actually, placed through a 14 French introducer. And he went to all kinds of places, being Englishman or half Englishman. And he went actually to the place where he went to medical school in Nottingham and started a program there. And this is Brad Hopkinson, the man in charge of the unit there at the time. And they did the very first ruptured aneurysm with aortic uniauric device and published it. I don't know exactly who did the first, Frank, you, or they did in Nottingham, but apparently they published first. Okay, Frank had a hard time accepting that. In the meantime, I already have seen what the stent grafting could offer, and we were waiting for Tim to show up in Malmö, Sweden. He missed the plane or something happened, and we didn't wait more for him, so he placed a system that we're using for covered esophageal stents. We turned the system upside down, and using that's exactly the delivery system for the esophageal stent, with a braided suture line going through a cannula, and then attaching to the top stent, the only stent, unsupported aortomonoiliac system. Pull out the dilator of the 20 French sheet, clamp that, and a very simple, very rude. Tim considered that system to be really, rude system, and a crude system, but in spite of that was highly versatile and very simple to use, placing the stent graft right across this funnel. And this is what we did in November 93, and started with that and did quite a few patients. In the meantime, in Hamburg, Wolf Stelter, being enthusiastic about all new technology from laparoscopic surgery and now the Stanford, working in a small communal hospital actually, and he was a general surgeon. So he placed his first Sten-Graft in August 94, and he was using crack stent or Mintic device, Vanguard device, very flimsy structure, and he realized how flimsy that was and proposed already at the early stage, 92, to make a hole in the graft and then catheterize it from contralateral side to have a more stability, basically. But all that idea evolved, and Claude Mial from France patented that in 93, and that was Stentor device, Vanguard device. Subsequently, he did his own first Stentor device in 97. But the real, successful Stentor bifurcated modular device was placed by Wolf Stelter in Frankfurt in August 94. Didn't hold very well because it was unstable and had to be repaired subsequently. And this is the day after the successful, successful placement of a bifurcated modular device, Stelter in the middle, Claude to the right, and then we have the man who placed hundreds of these Vanguard devices, an interventional radiologist from Freiburg, Ulrich Blum. Unfortunately, he left us at early stage because of cancer. Now in Frankfurt, they were working very hard and ran into the very first serious complication. 5 of their first 22 patients died from so-called post-implantation syndrome because of a sepsis-like condition, and this was caused by poorly washed material. We worked hard with our device, Shooter, Vanguard, and subsequently Zenit, identified that the devices were unstable. They were migrating, 50% migration. And we saw that in a severe migration in some of the patients, both uniauric and bifurcated, and all of that prompted us to study the longitudinal forces of pull-down forces on the stent graft, and identified that that was related to, can I move this forward? To the configuration of the stent graft with the longer legs, angulated legs, contributing to increasing the pull-down forces in the top. The stent never healed, and there was no way of attaching this stent to the aortic wall. Therefore, we looked at the transrenal stenting with deep barbs in the aortic wall, studied what that effect was penetrating the aortic wall with any serious consequences, and then checked the different devices that existed and identified that the device that was closest to the hand-sewn suture anastomosis was Zenit. And this is back to Wolf Stelter Place in Frankfurt. We have heard about the contribution of Jeff White visiting Stelter, and Stelter too discovered the instability of the stent grafts, sometimes to the point that they had to be removed. And subsequently, all of this led to the Zenit stent graft, fully stented, long body, transrenal fixation with deep barbs, providing secure fixation. And this is David Hartley, really the man with the constructing of all the Cook stent graft, and Michael Lawrence Brown here in the audience from Royal Perth. And this is more of a pictures of those days. Roy Greenberg, you've heard about his contribution. He came to Malmö like Tim and spent time with us working. The very first fenestration was placed by John Anderson in Adelaide, 1998 in Australia. And the very first fenestration in Europe was placed by Wolf Stelter, 99, a year later. The preservation of the accessory renal artery. Stelter also discovered that the coaxially placed tubular stent grafts provided stability that led to composite stent graft, as you know that very well, allowing for the two pieces to be independently moving, and that can lead sometimes to separation, but can be easily repaired, but definitely turn out to be very helpful in a fenestrated situation where the stents in the renals didn't got pulled down. It's more like a movement between the two pieces. Then we moved on developing branches for the internal iliac artery, and a group of people working on that. coming to the subsequent development of the Stanford that is of today, modular one. Tim developed his branch Stanford for thoracoabdominal aneurysms, and he was the first actually to cover the whole Stanford, the whole aorta, from the arch down to the thoracoabdominal aorta. Very much thanks to development of the arched branch device that allows for easy catheterization from the carotid arteries. And I happened to be the first in Europe to place this Stanford in April 2010. Eurostar was the large registry in Europe that contributed to observing all the development of the stent grafting in those days, with multiple participants across whole Europe. And at the end, I would like to just share with you my thoughts on what it takes to make innovation. And simply personality, you just have to observe and find solutions to that, but that's definitely just only the beginning. Most of the times then comes the real barriers and hurdles to overcome, rejection from the work colleagues, from established discipline, and then comes the setbacks, the complications, and at the end, if you don't have money, you can't make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Krasi. Next speaker is another pioneer from Australia, Michael Lawrence Brown.
Thank you for having me here today, and thanks for Mike for the invitation. I bring you greetings from Australia, and many Australians have contributed to this technology. Aneurysm surgery is really born out of occlusive disease, and when we started, we used the principles associated with occlusive disease. But occlusive disease is tunneling engineering, and what we were going to build were bridges. And the bridging engineering is very different to tunneling. In 1992, Jim May and Jack Harris is the one in the middle who held this unit together, invited one who they'd spent some time with, I believe, to Sydney, and they sent a flyer around. This is just a little hospital meeting, and I'm on the other side of Australia, and this flyer came past, but I've been working with an interventional radiologist in my own lab through the 80s, and this flyer we paid attention to. So we went to Sydney in 1992, and by 1995, 93, 94, was the first international symposium held outside the hospital. And that was pulled together really by Jeff White, who's been mentioned today. So what the Sydney guys did was they brought the concepts to reality in Sydney. And as you said, the term endoleak, but that meeting in Sydney was the forum for many, many people around the world to come. It was probably the premier forum for a while. So when I went across with my interventional radiology colleague, Peter Kelsey, whom we have been working with, and you can see why I like traveling with Peter. And this is the device that's been shown today that Juan showed. And I had problems with this because there was no way I was going to get access to a giant palmar stent. Also, I didn't like the idea of putting something rigid in an artery that was expanding and contracting. So I went back to the West, and for those of you who don't know the West is 1/3 of the whole of Australia, and Australia is the size of the United States. That bright light that you see on the western coast is Perth, and there's a little black hole if you go due east where Skylab came down. But what we had in the West was a fearsome force in the presence of David Hartley. And David had been making catheters and wires and balloons for Cook in Australia, which was the only device manufacturing company, and therefore had direct access to the Jian-Turco stent. And this is what had been presented at RSNA in 1986 with Jian-Turco and Lawrence in a dog. And so we based our graft on this, and to get over the fact that it wasn't stented all the way, you can see the internal stent at the bottom. We used a shepherd's hook to push it up out of the sheath. But I didn't like the idea really. And going to aorta uni-iliac was against my surgical principles because first I didn't like destroying normal anatomy, and secondly I never liked the fem-fem crossover. So when Tim Shooter came in 93, and that was to the small hospital meeting still, and he showed his pullover graft, thought this is a good idea, I'd like a bifurcated graft. So we went back and we constructed this phantom, X-ray phantom, that we could use instead of going to the animal lab with wax, and then encased it in resin and applied these valves at the bottom, which we borrowed from the IVF technology that had been developed in Australia. And then we had a device that worked, but also, being a phantom, of course, I called it Mr. Walker, for Ghost Who Walks. And if I said I was operating on Mr. Walker, I wasn't pulled out. If I said I was doing research, they'd have pulled me out of research for sure. And this is the graft we came up with in 1994. We presented 5 cases, and that's where I met Frank Dake. And it's also where I met Mike Dake and Frank Veith. And you could see we could alter the diameter at the top, and it was a modular graft with a control at the top and the bottom. We did the experiments that we think we should have done. We placed stents across orifices in animals to see what the reaction would be. We tried to move the anchor stent away from the graft, and we came up with fatigue fractures. At that time, I had a lab of my own, in a modified cardiology lab. You can see the small head, and it had been converted to DSA. So the first principle we said is you cannot do this work without good imaging. So we always worked in a cath lab. The problem was that these were class 2 theatres and not class 1. So to overcome the infection criticism, the senior vascular theatre nurse became our sewer, and she was a very good sewer, and some of you know Sue Morris. And there she is working with David, making a graft. By 1998, the graft was being used across Australia and was known as the H&LB Stent-Graft. And at that time, Cook had a number of people working in different parts of the world. And in great organisation, they came to Perth with, as you can see, Tim Shooter there, Krasi Ivansev, Brian Hopkinson on the right with his interventional radiology colleague Simon Whitaker. And on the extreme left is the managing director of Cook Australia, who was also West Australian. Now, if you look down here on the left and the right, and you'll see there's one person that was there who was a trainee of Krassi's at the time. Krassi, I don't know why he's not in the photograph, but you might, and that was Roy Greenberg. So this group of people that got together to work together is seen to have expanded in this lower photograph, where you can see Tim and Krassi, and there's Will Stelter. And in the middle was John Anderson. And John Anderson had skills of intervention that exceeded everybody's. Brian Hopkinson, myself, and by this stage Roy was in the photograph. But these are not the important ones. As Dorothy Abel will tell you from her workshop in the FDA, it's the guys at the back. It's the big brass and the guys that play all the violins and things. These are a mixture of Americans, Europeans, and Australians. And they're the guys that really make it work. So by 98, this is the graft that was produced, and this graft has not changed that much in 20 years. So what we provided was durability. Now we must set guidelines as to what should be used, and you'll see that 70% of the grafts inserted were outside a guideline, and most of those were outside the guidelines in the neck. So I sympathise with regulators who have to control the implementation of devices across a whole spectrum. This guy on the left is Tom Brown, who came with an idea. He came out to work with me in Ireland, and he said, why don't we put an angioplasty balloon through a hole and then deploy the graft over the angioplasty balloon, then we got a fenestration. I tried it, didn't work too well, but John Anderson nailed it, and he nailed it literally by putting a stent in there, a bare stent, and then he put in a covered stent, and that turns it into a bronze stent graft. So as Krassi showed, this was his first case, and by doing that, he extended the neck up to the right renal artery. You can see it works because there's a space between the cap and where the hole is. Will Stelter came up with this composite graft, but the purpose was to put the bifurcation of the graft on the bifurcation of the aorta for stability. That was his purpose. But what it did, it provided the ability to rotate the top part independently of the bottom part. So that fenestration moved across the board this way, and you can see on the right-hand side, being able to reduce the diameter at the back with a wire that goes through loops, it meant that you had space to rotate and orientate the graft within the aorta. But all this was intuitive. And David was an intuitive engineer, but we needed some science behind this. And this fellow here worked in the Commonwealth laboratories, running a fluid dynamics laboratory in Melbourne, with a PhD from Rice University, and his specialty was astrophysics. So he really put some mathematics into this. And he built a rig, and at the bottom right, you can see stent test stimulator. We'd put the device in there, we'd subject it to what the human body would subject a test graft to. We found by 2000 we were doing more endovascular grafts than we were doing open, but then it plateaued. And the reason it plateaued was that we were covering all those that were suitable. But we wasn't suitable to go above the renal arteries, or when the neck wasn't suitable, or into the iliacs. And that's what made the difference when we had to go up and down from the aorta. So in levels of evidence of medicine, level 5 is, or 6 is expert opinion or an anecdote, and we know that's not sufficient evidence. A small series gives you level 4. A big series, and this was 150, gives you level 3. And if you have a randomized controlled clinical trial, you have medical evidence that gives you the right to move forward. And that was the EVAR-1 trial. Now, the results from 3, from the orange one to the green one, were the same. And the reason they were the same was that more than 50% of the grafts used in the EVAR trial were from Australia. So in 2003, 10th of April, I sat next to Frank Veith in the FDA meeting, and there was approval, and the baton changed. The baton changed from me to Roy Greenberg, and I gave up outcomes analysis and collection from that point. But we continued to make devices that people wanted, and the facility finally closed in West Perth in 2011, no longer exists. So in 93 we went from this to 2011 to this. Now, one good workshop deserves another, and Dorothy was extremely helpful to us in determining how we would and what rules we would follow to make something. And here she is at a workshop in Australia with her Australian friends. This was actually a laparoscopic workshop, and the gentleman standing with Dorothy is Eve-Marie Dion from Canada. So you're right, it's been said today already, and this is in Dotta's memorabilia cabinet. I'm sure Mike's seen it. In Oregon Health Services University in the Dotta Institute. And it's not absolutely true, because I had innumerable colleagues around the world that gave us support. I had special institutions that gave me support, and I thank all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next topic is about imaging, and is by Dominique Fleischmann.
All right, thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, which is probably not a surprise because I'm the first non-giant here in the room for many reasons. So I'm one of the cardiovascular images here at Stanford, and so my task has been to talk about everything that happened in the last 25 years in cardiovascular imaging, so I'll take up about 2 hours of your time now. Anyway, so Mike already showed this picture here, and I think one of the important aspects of imaging or of cardiovascular imaging really came with this picture here. So this was the world's first CT angiogram, and this was done a renal CTA that Mike already described, but you have to keep in mind that the time of acquisition for this was 30 seconds. And back in those days, this was phenomenally fast, because before that, any CT scan of the chest, for example, took a minute or two, because you had to step and shoot, you have to move the table, scan, move the table, etc., and you had to do a slow drip infusion, whereas for a CT angio, now you had 30 seconds where you could inject contrast using a power injector and then use some 3D processing. So the enabling technology really for CT angiography was the spiral or helical technology, which really made CT a volumetric technique rather than a slice-by-slice technique, and allowing fast contrast injection with a power injection. And then it coincided also with the rapid developments in computer processing and therefore image processing, which really was a game changer at that time. Now, to have a volumetric technique, I think, is particularly important if you want to deal with accurate measurements of small structures or relatively small structures like vessels. And you see here on this animation that when you have a volumetric technique, you can always go along the center path of these vessels, and you will always know that you are orthogonal to the vessel, which allows you to make much more accurate measurements than if you would use, for example, conventional angiography, because those of you who look at a lot of angios know that it's actually not that accurate to do some measurements. It was also better than IVUS, because IVUS had the problem that if it was obliquely oriented within an aorta, you could be very much off axis and overestimate particularly the large or the major diameter of an aorta. Now, once really CT became important for endografting was about 1999, and that's when CT changed from single row CT to multi-detector row CT. It's essentially like having multiple rows of detectors on your CT scanner and multiplying the acquisition speed. So now the scan time was about 25 seconds for the entire abdomen, pelvis, and femoral arteries, which really was the hallmark for improved endovascular treatment planning. So for example, if you looked at AAAs, you really could now finally measure proximal fixation. You could look how long a neck was, what the diameter was, the angulation, as well as distal fixations, all those details that you would otherwise not know before you would go into that procedure. And also post Stanford, you obviously could see relatively decent pictures with that technology. Also, you could do follow-up studies, which I have to admit, we see some things that you probably wouldn't want to see, like complications. But one of the things that has always stayed the same, even to these days, is that you use CT to plan your procedures. And here you see one of the best software for treatment planning that you could see. It comes new every year, and it's called Vascular Surgery Fellows, because those are the people who really know how to use the software best, because several of them are in the room, and they really have to learn how to come up to a treatment decision and a plan based on the images. Now, not all stent grafts go well, and you can sometimes come across some which have a more unhappy face, like this one here, a patient who had a stent graft placed in 2000, and an old anorex, and you can see not all of them are very durable, so this slipped obviously into the aortic aneurysm sac, and you can see or imagine it's very hard to fix it once the device is really kinked and even results in a stenosis here of one of these limbs here. Another example here, so since Mike already used the term endotrash before, this is what we call endotrash. It's another completely disintegrated device that happens if the patient lives much longer than you probably expected, and then you end up with a lot of these fragments within the aneurysm wall and in the thrombus, and here you can see where all these fragments of this device are along the aorta. Another late complication that you can see once in a while is here a patient who had also an endograft in 2000, had a suspected endoleak in 2011, and then it slowly started to grow, but it was hard to see where really the endoleak would come from. And in this particular case, you see these little suture breaks, which are most of the time, in fact, benign and an incidental finding. But here we did some dynamic acquisition. So here the CTs is so fast now that you can, in fact, make several acquisitions while you give just one contrast injection. And you can see where the contrast comes from, at least the direction where it comes from, which then confirms or really points you to the explanation that it's really a fabric tear that's associated with all these suture breaks. And then you can make measurements. You can in fact see on these time attenuation curves that the contrast in the endoleak actually comes earlier than the lumbar arteries, which proves that that's not the cause. It's not the cause, but really has to come from the graft itself. Now, for thoracic aortic imaging, As you know, you don't really need a CT to place a thoracic aortic stent graft, as you have seen in several examples. But for sure, I would argue that it helps, and you can see some things that we really didn't see before if you have a good CT scan. For example, here is how a primary intima tear looks like in a CT scan. Here it's angiographically, and here is how it looks in 3D. I mean, this gives you a very different perspective how these little tears look like. This comma-shaped tear, we're sitting here in the aortic root looking up the arch, and you see how a primary intima tear looks like. So this was one of the heroic actions in a patient who was not a surgical candidate, where a endograft was placed by Mike, and you see here actually also kind of a chimney, which was a protective chimney device here in the innominate artery, just in case something goes wrong. But it went very well. Here you see a post-op 3D image now. 3D imaging and post-processing also became much better over time. Another thoracic example here, that's a patient who has a so-called retro A dissection, where the primary intima tear is in fact in the descending thoracic aorta. You can see all these pulsation artifacts in the ascending aorta. The patient clearly has a type A lesion, but not contrast flowing in from the front, but actually retrocranially filling that. And that's an important piece of information to know, because that at least gives you the option, if the patient is not a surgical candidate, to try to treat this also with an endograft and cover the primary intima tear and the descending thoracic aorta, and treat a type A lesion with a stent graft in the descending thoracic aorta. So much of this really has been enabled then not only by the three-dimensional capabilities of CTA, but also the phenomenal and rapid development of CT by itself. Now imagine we started out with 40 seconds scan time for an abdomen pelvis CT angio. Today we are about in less than 1 second. We can even acquire this in 0.4 seconds, so it's 100 times faster than 25 years ago. And also we can now do dynamic CT, which means time-resolved CT, which you have seen, but also some ECG gating, which really helps to suppress motion artifacts, and it's predominantly used, or was initiated mainly to image the coronary arteries, but it also helps for any imaging where cardiac pulsation is a problem, and it helps to, for example, here see a type A dissection, and it explains, for example, what that dissection flap does, which is completely torn off from the ascending aorta, and you see the dissection flap, in fact, prolapsing through the valve plane. But more importantly, and I think for some treatment planning, is that you see exactly where the flap originates relative to the coronary artery ostia. Now, time-resolved imaging or gated imaging is also important for post-stent graft follow-up. So this is one of those complex cases. Patient of history had a type A dissection repaired with an ascending, a total arch, and an elephant trunk, so highlighted here in red a bit. And then he was subsequently treated with an endograft from the elephant trunk down distally, but still his false lumen was growing, and it was not quite clear where that would come from. And you look here, well, maybe there's a little fenestration here at the level of the renal arteries, or we look more proximally, well, there's another little fenestration, really tiny, probably from an intercostal here at the descending thoracic aorta, just distal to the stent graft. So maybe that's the culprit lesion, maybe we should cover this. But then when you look at the 4D data set, it turns out that there is truly a contrast coming from the true lumen into that false lumen flow here. But when you look very carefully in the gated study, you can see that there's actually more flow coming back from the false lumen into the true lumen. So what this little fenestration does is, in fact, it actually relieves pressure from the false lumen rather than the other way around. And then if you go even further, taking advantage of all these now 4D imaging, you can see a little puff of contrast here in the proximal portion of this aneurysm sac. And if you look then just change the rendering a little bit, you can see, in fact, the source of the leak happens to be right here, where the island of the supra-arch vessels, it just comes off here from the left subclavian artery with a puff of contrast here in the false lumen. So that's information that you might miss if you don't have a cardiac resolved or a 4D data set. Then a final comment that obviously all these communications are also very nicely illustrated or visualized or even quantified with a 4D flow MR. You can see back and forth flow in all kinds of communications, and the importance of that is that But we have recently shown, for example, that there is way more to predicting the risk of late complication than just the maximum diameter, because it's not only presence of connective tissue disease or the size of the aortic aneurysm, but it's in fact also the flow that drains the false lumen that has an effect on late complications. Also, the number of intercostals play a role, although we do not fully understand why that is. We hope we can solve or answer some of those questions with computational fluid dynamics. I can tell you it's a very complicated process and more difficult than we thought. You can relatively easily calculate the flow in the true and the false lumen and come up with some pressure measurements, but it turns out if you have a rigid model and if you don't account for the fact that actually the wall pulsates and that the flap moves, that all the numbers are in fact not really very accurate. And this is just one of the first attempts of one of our co-investigators of Katrin, that this is the first deformable model where you can actually see the flap moving back and forth over the cardiac cycle. All right. So in summary, I think the endovascular revolution, which means after really it became commercially available, really did coincide with the revolution in non-invasive imaging, particularly with volumetric CT. The early adoption of new imaging and post-processing enabled advancements in endovascular procedure that I think really were initiated by each other, or kind of a lot of synergies between them. And imaging is still the current standard of part of the current standard of patient care. It's essential training for all imagers in cardiovascular images, as well as vascular surgeons or cardiothoracic surgeons. And I think it's a strong and exciting collaboration for now and for many years in the future. Thank you.
I think I've been asked here to introduce Dorothy Abel solely. My experience with the FDA predates Dorothy's birth, I do believe. But in 1965, there was no device legislation within the FDA. And they decided that we needed regulation, and it was quite obvious that we did. So they called the NIH and asked if a group of surgeons would help them classify devices according to risk. I've been involved with the FDA since that time, and it's been up and down, like many relationships, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And now the relationship is good and getting better, and it's because of people like Dorothy Abel. So Dorothy, would you please grace us with your presence?
So it really is cool to be part of this celebration. I really appreciate being included, because you guys have done all the really hard stuff. And, you know, my history is going to be obviously very different from what Dr. Dake put together. First off, it fits on one slide. And I'm not going to talk about the clinical experience so much, but the one thing that Dr. Dake did miss out on was that it was 30 years ago this week that I started working at FDA and regulating vascular devices. I know, right? So we've known each other a long time. And so what have I been doing in the last 30 years? Well, we've been trying to promote and protect public health. And we are really hoping that patients will have timely access to high-quality, safe, and effective medical devices. We're also trying to promote innovation, which is probably why Tom said such kind words to me, and looking to improve our post-market surveillance and balancing our pre- and post-market evaluation devices. Probably most important, we're trying to make sure that you have the information that you need and that patients have the information they need to make well-informed decisions about their own care. What this really is boiled down to primarily is the evaluation and the review of a couple different types of documents. We have our investigational device exemptions applications, and those are for our clinical studies in the United States, and then the documents to request approval once enough information is available. And that's our pre-market approval application, or PMA. What that means is I've spent a lot of time reading things that other people have done. So we don't actually do the testing at FDA. The manufacturers, the people who submit the documents, give us the information that they have available, and we work with them to try to get the right information to show that the device is safe and effective. And you can imagine that was pretty challenging early on. We didn't have any more experience than you did, so we had these applications showing up, and they would do the testing that would be similar to a stent or a vascular graft, And we knew that that wasn't enough, but what was the right thing? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've transformed in terms of our evaluation of these devices. The other thing that we do a lot of is documentation, and that helps with optimizing consistency, make sure that we're treating everybody fairly, but also seeing as we evolve that we're doing the right thing, that we have documentation of why. And that not only briefs our managers on our decisions, but importantly helps you understand what went into our regulatory decisions. It's kind of fun to look back at where I started and how things were done. I would handwrite my memos using carbon paper, so I would have a copy for my own records and one for the official record. And of course now everything's electronic, both the writing of the memos and the storage. We've had an evolution of communication too. Joan would answer our phone, type our letters, and send them off. Remember when we had to have those slide carousels? We could never have this many speakers. We would have to worry about switching the slides. So it's much more complicated than it is now. Now everything's electronic. But if we look at the evolution of the reviews, that has changed maybe even more so than the technology. The first IDEs, I was the lead reviewer on most of them. I would have one medical officer work with me in the beginning as Wolf Saperstein, and then Paul Shandison, that some of you know. We'd have a biocompatibility person, a statistician, someone to look at the animal studies, and 3 engineers, one for the delivery system, because we didn't understand delivery systems when we worked on vascular grafts, one for the durability of the endografts, because they understood the need to look at the metals and not just the graft material, and then one for the other non-durability aspects, and that's the stuff that I could figure out, even, permeability and those sorts of things of the graft material. Current IDEs, we have a lot more people. So fortunately, I don't have to do them all. I'm usually somewhat involved, but there's somewhere between 6 and 7 different lead reviewers that might get the IDE. There's one primary medical officer, but often they have colleagues that help. We bring in, of course, our cardiothoracic surgeons when we're getting up into the arch and the ascending. We have a whole team of biocompatibility reviewers, and we can argue that that's sometimes good and sometimes not so good. We actually have a veterinarian looking at the animal studies. We bring in the chemists when we need them, and it goes on in terms of the team. So we actually have gone from somewhere around 7 or 8 reviewers on a team, and it was usually pretty much the same team looking at all the IDEs, to 11 plus reviewers, and that team varies depending on who's available to look at them. So we really have had quite a bit of growth in terms of our teams at FDA. Terry Woods and I are the only ones that have really been there the whole time, but there are some others that have stuck with us for quite a bit of time. But it's interesting to look at when I started at FDA, there were about 35 people in the entire division looking at all the cardiovascular devices that there were, and now there's over 100 of us in the division. So similar to what I talked about before, we went from having to deal with paper and reading these huge piles of paper to everything now staring at a computer screen. So if we look at global trends, well, the devices used to be and still tend to be marketed outside the United States first. And it's not just that they're marketed outside first. The indications that we have in the United States are more limited because of our requirements to demonstrate safety and effectiveness for the different indications. The early evaluation of endografts started to move outside the United States. It's somewhat coming back with our early feasibility study program that I helped to start a couple years ago. But if you look at, you've seen some of the when things became available, sometimes I think it's a little unfair comparison, because just because a device isn't approved in a particular country, it doesn't mean that you can't have access to it. So in the United States, although the access may have been more limited because of being used under an IDE instead of being marketed, we were able to get those devices to at least some of the patients early on. But so it's kind of helpful, I think, though, to look at the difference between the European Union and the way that they would handle devices. They didn't necessarily require that there would be any clinical data, especially early on. And so if we look at when the CE mark was granted for devices and when we started looking at them in clinical studies, the first clinical study we had was 4 years before that device got the CE mark. Of course, the CE mark didn't exist when it first started, but I like that one because it shows that we're way ahead of them in terms of the availability of the devices. And most of them, though, 11 out of 15, we were either at the same time or the pretty similar time frame in terms of when they were available. So if we look at the next part of my timeline, I want to talk a little more about the IDEs and the marketing applications. So as I mentioned, our IDEs are where you can do the clinical studies in the United States. So you have to have your report of prior investigations that includes all the data to support doing the clinical study and then the investigational plan. And we can either have those sponsored by manufacturers or by the sponsor investigators. And of course, the manufacturers are looking at completely new next generation devices or modified devices, whereas the sponsor investigators can be making some of their own devices. You'll be glad to know that a lot of what we saw today did actually end up in IDEs, and we continue to have those IDEs of new devices made by individuals. Sometimes the manufacturers are addressing unmet needs, but not always. But often the sponsor investigators are addressing unmet needs. And often the devices are used in the high-risk patients, for example. This large number of sponsor investigators that we've had with endovascular grafts is really different than what we've seen with any other technology, as far as I know. So the fact that you've driven this technology, you've contributed to this technology is so much different than other medical devices. So what are the data used for from an IDE? Of course, there's fine-tuning the devices, techniques, and patient selection for a manufacturer. And also importantly, I think, is that they have used them to figure out if a device really is a viable option. And we've had several devices that were evaluated under IDEs in the United States, marketed outside of the United States, that ended up having to go away. They just didn't work out as well. So our controlled evaluation did actually help to protect some patients, I believe. And then they're looking to capture clean data to support their marketing applications. Sponsor investigators want to provide the treatment options for their patients, especially when there aren't any available, but at the same time identifying changes needed to improve the devices, techniques, and the patient selection that fed back into the manufacturer's device development, evaluation, and instructions for use. And again, this is really unprecedented. As far as I know, there isn't any other device that's been developed this way, where even when we have those separate studies, they're so key in terms of our evaluation of the technology. So if we look at the trends in our IDEs, first one was in 91. It really started to ramp up in 96. I've got the manufacturer studies in pink and the sponsor investigators in blue. It has nothing to do with gender. And then if you really want to look at the trends of the number of IDEs we have, you can look at the black line. And these are IDEs that ultimately were approved. So that's the date, the year that they were submitted, and then when they were approved. And remember, these didn't just get approved and then go away. They last for at least 5 years, or if you're a Cleveland Clinic, they last, I think, from 2001 still today. So these studies are still ongoing, so there's still a lot of access to these innovative devices in the United States. And of course, the types of devices that have been evaluated have changed over time. We started with the AAA and then the descending thoracic aneurysms. The short neck and DTA transection and dissection started somewhere around the 2004, and now moved on to the maintaining iliac perfusion, thoracoabdominal aortic aneurysms, and lesions of the arch and ascending. The non-clinical and clinical data requirements for these submissions has changed. We've certainly always applied risk-based assessments to identify the appropriate testing and clinical data to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. So that means if you've got another AAA device, it's likely that the data requirements would be different than if you were doing the first ascending study. And our evaluation of the devices has evolved as experiences gained. So we tried randomization. We thought every endoleak was equal. So we looked at things differently in the beginning. Of course, we figured out that there wasn't clinical equipoise and they weren't created equal. We moved on to concurrent controls, only including significant endoleaks in our definition of effectiveness. And figured out concurrent controls were even not necessary because these devices don't have an issue with safety primarily, at least the ones that we had been dealing with. And then we've moved on to performance goals for both safety and effectiveness, focusing on the events that are most likely associated with device performance, including problems seen in prior studies. But probably the most important part of our evolution is the fact that it's been done with the help and cooperation of so many of you in the room and so many others in terms of our clinical partners and manufacturers, so that we aren't working in isolation at FDA. We've done this together. Some of the things that we've worked on together have already been mentioned, the registries, so that we could have some control data and have those get away from doing the concurrent controls. We've got the registry with the sponsor investigator studies that helped us to set the expectations for the descending thoracic studies. The TVAR dissection registry really allowed us to balance pre- and post-market data requirements so that we could get our devices on label for treatment of all dissections while continuing to capture important information. And we've even worked together to try to figure out how we can get the information needed to give CMS what they need so that we could have continued coverage for our IDE studies. So moving on to the pre-market approval applications, you can see, of course, that the first approval for the AAA device was in '99, and we would keep getting a few more of those. Oh, and this is poor Ancure. They did come off the market for regulatory reasons, not for performance reasons, and that's not my part of regulation, by the way. And then the thoracic, the initial approval was much later, as was talked about later. And it wasn't until 2013 that we got the additional indications included, but they're not showing on the chart because those devices were already approved. But the important thing to note here too is that we haven't had devices come off the market because they had major safety issues. Some ultimately were replaced by newer generations, and so that's why you see the upswing and then a couple went away. I need to talk a little bit about the standards. I apologize, there's a lot to cover in so little time, but we started working on how to best evaluate endovascular grafts, both from a non-clinical and a clinical standpoint back in 1997, which is pretty early in terms of when the devices showed up, because usually standardization means you're documenting what's already been figured out. Well, we kind of figured it out as we were documenting it. And so we started the work then, but we've continued it. So we've had several documents published in between, and we just updated the latest endovascular graft standard. And these standards are international. They're written by representatives from manufacturers, testing facilities, regulatory agencies, clinicians. We all work together to try to get those requirements established, and again, focusing on a risk-based rationale for the testing strategy. The standards are incredibly helpful to address regulatory requirements like the information needed in an IDE or a PMA. And they incorporate information from meetings like the FDA workshops that Michael Lawrence Brown mentioned and the Cleveland Clinic Greenberg Stent Summits, where we talk about what hasn't worked so well in terms of evaluating devices and the information we need to further improve our evaluation. So in summary, our endovascular grafts and their evaluation of regulation have been evolving with unprecedented collaboration and commitment between innovators, entrepreneurs, clinical professionals, manufacturers, regulators. You get the idea. So if you could all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, I'd really appreciate it, because I think it's really something to celebrate that we have had this collaborative relationship, and we've been able to do the things that we've been able to do with endografting. And none of this would have been possible without that sort of collaboration. And I really especially want to call out the thanks to the patients who are willing to give this a try so that we can continue to improve the health care of everyone. And I always like to remind you that things take time. It seems like we have had to wait for things we'd like to have happen sooner, but it just is what it is. Thank you.
You know, Dorothy led an effort of getting rid of combat and replacing combat with collaboration. And we really do owe her a debt of gratitude. From the patient's perspective, it's a good thing to happen, most certainly. And actually, in an economic standpoint, they're beginning to emphasize cost as part of design. And if we do that, hopefully we're going to reduce the cost of health care, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. So thank you very much, Dorothy.